Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Sophia Mercado, and I'm a member of the student lecture series here at Pavilion. Tonight, we're happy to be joined by Lucia Tahan. Lucia is a Los Angeles-based architect and spatial computing designer. Her work explores the relationship between architecture and virtual media. She regularly produces exhibitions and research about augmented reality and its relationship to the built environment. Her research work on food delivery infrastructure is currently exhibited in the Spanish Pavilion at the 2023 Venice Architecture Biennale. Her work has been featured in museums and institutions such as the Berlage, ELF, EPFL, Louisiane, Bi-City Biennale of Architecture, and much more. Her work has been published by media such as Architectural Design, Art Daily, eFlux, and just to name a few. We're so glad to be joined by Lucia here today. And as always, I'd like to thank Elise, Jackie, and Jeffrey Brown for their continued and generous support of the student lecture series. And without further ado, Lucia Tahan.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming today. Very honored to be here, and I just really admire this institution. Thanks also for showing me the work of the students. I wanted to bring up a project here that deals with the production of food, but I wanted to start with an introduction about who I am and what my career has been like. It hasn't been the most straightforward path, and so that's why I wanted to share it. My first project out of school was this built house. So I started as a very traditional architect. And I built this in Extremadura in Spain. It's in southern Spain, which is where I was born and where I studied. And we were just, me and two friends, we were 26. We built this house that had a pool inside. It just came to us by chance. And this was even before I graduated. So I really was convinced that I wanted to be a, so to speak, traditional architect that would build with brick and mortar. And yeah, after that, I graduated with this thesis, which was based on a research I did in Jerusalem, where I went to live for a year and a half. And it just dealt with the urban fabric in the city of Jerusalem and how it could be updated and adapted to different political conditions on the site. And that took me many years. It took me 3 years to finish. Then I started doing exhibition work. I participated together with Vika Rebek in the Slovenian Pavilion for the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018, where I started to have an interest in interactive installations. So in this installation, which was about water, people could come and touch the different columns, which were a homage to an architect called Plečnik, which you may have may be familiar with, from Slovenia, who had devised a building that was based on a pyramid inserted inside of another volume. And that pyramid was represented here by these dematerialized columns. And that was the first time for me that I was more interested in these extrusions that became more and more abstract in my work, until eventually you'll see that I went all the way into software and AR, VR. This is another project that I did around that time. I was exhibited in Seoul and in Rome, on a site in Rome. And it was about the extrusion of some urban little islands for pavilions inside of a garden in Rome. And I created these models for this that were exhibited, in which I was trying to do a 3D object with only two-dimensional materials. So I used this brass thread that doesn't actually stand on its own, and just black paper. And because of the irregularity of the paper cuts, it stands. If all the paper cuts were the same shape or a circle, it would twist and fall. So it's just because it's asymmetrical that it can stand. And one thing that was interesting to me doing this work was how the people who were coming to see the exhibition were approaching the model and looking at it from side. because they wanted to see how it stood, like how can it stand. And this dichotomy between the two-dimensional things and three-dimensional things became a bit of an obsession of mine. And I think it's very much at the core of what we do in architecture. It's about geometry and representation. But it was just an interest. And you can see the three models here and how ethereal they become. They stand. We had to put a glass around them because apart from looking at them like this, we're also touching them and throwing them. They would just break if they fell. Next, I started doing software, and this is a startup that I founded out of the new museum here in New York. Had an incubator for artists and architects called New Inc. And we did this software that was meant to help museums curate exhibitions online and have a 3D representation of their exhibitions and their collections. And lately I've done work such as this augmented reality exhibition in Madrid, has also been exhibited in Barcelona, where I wanted to represent the syntax of the internet. So what you see here is a column that represents the language of the internet, and then its dematerialization as we enter an era in which AR, VR will be pervasive, and therefore a three-dimensional internet and an immersive internet will become a new language with which we express ourselves online and in our digital lives. And I was interested in bringing all these elements that I believe constitute a syntax or constitute a dictionary of the language of the internet, including things that are used for expression like emojis, memes, fake news, and many other types of forms of expression that are unique to the internet and made possible by it. And when the internet becomes more three-dimensional, as in through AR, VR, I believe that new forms of expression will come into being and become pervasive, and we will find new ways of expressing ourselves three-dimensionally but digitally. I also did this another AR exhibition or project, which was a homage to Pierluigi Nervi, and I was interested in bringing one of his structures to this neighborhood in Madrid that was actually built at the same time as Nervi's structures, and I was interested in the contrast between those lived spaces and his work, or in this more fun work that I just did for myself, honestly. I was taking this famous drawing from Learning from Vegas, and I made an AR effect that allows you to place that anywhere you want it. So you can name anything as a monument in your city, and everything becomes a monument thanks to things being augmented and being shareable on the internet. These are some other Spark AR examples of augmented reality that I've done, where Spark AR is mostly used for face effects, but I was more interested in what happens when you turn the camera around and you try to transform the world through geometry and through camera feeds. So I'm interested in things like lifting the ground. On the right, you can see an experiment in which there are some bubbles there that are fake and some that are real. And I'm also interested in the lack of a barrier between, or the lack of distinguishability between what's real and what's not. A very psychotic future and reality where we will not know what is true and what is not. This was another exhibition also dealing with AR and with different aspects of how media has been embedded into architecture throughout the millennia. A very, very interesting exhibition and book. If you ever want to find it, it's called Database Network Interface, The Architecture of Information, and it contains many examples from the past and the present for architecture as media. This is a big project that I did in 2019, in which I tried to demonstrate how people in the future will live in their homes with augmented reality interfaces embedded in their homes. And in this work, people who were coming to the exhibition were able to see through an iPad 3 different scenarios of how that could play out, and just see that in AR. The first prototype for that was this box that represents a living space, even though the actual furniture and the things that enable us to inhabit the world and understand it as domestic were not there. They were just virtually there. But people were very engaged with it nonetheless. I was asking them to draw their own home inside. And then in the exhibition itself, in the final presentation, there was a living room that I built. This is a real physical space. And then through the iPad, people could see the 3D representation of this. In this scene, I was interested in what the device sees. It's spatial data that is collected both in real time or that could be potentially stored. So through AR, it's possible that architects will have access to post-occupational studies for years and years of how every minute living conditions of people in a house change. In the second one, the furniture and the things inside the home get augmented. But this also opens the possibility of advertising being embedded in the home. And so homes become, or domestic architecture becomes, a kind of infinite screen. And I believe in this idea of an infinite screen as architecture very much. I think it's dangerous, but I also think it's a very powerful concept for the future. Here you can see a spectrum of realities and a reality slider with people inhabiting more real realities and more unreal realities, and just sliding in a slider between the two on a daily basis. Those were the 3 scenes. But the actual topic of my presentation today is Foodscapes. So Foodscapes is the Spanish pavilion at the 18th Venice Architecture Biennale. So it's being exhibited now, and it's now coming to an end. And it has to do with the chains of production of food. So it's a journey through all of the architectures that enable food to be produced and arrive eventually into our bodies. And the actual amount of architecture and landscape that is invested into the production of food and the consumption of food is really enormous and sometimes very invisible when, digestion and eating is something that all of us do on a daily basis. The pavilion is a kind of research pavilion, so it has materials that then enable a public program for researchers who are going to have been there for these months, writing and researching further and further into the means of production and the architectures that were initially investigated by the people invited, like myself. So you can see that all of the pictures from the research that we did are mixed in the pavilion, and then they are archived in this website. And it is structured into recipes, a series of recipes and a series of films. There are also 4 films dealing with landscape and the agricultural production landscapes, specifically in Spain. The different recipes, so there were 10 different architecture studios invited to do 1 recipe each. And these recipes have to do with a real food, but also are an excuse to explain a chain of production. These are just 4 of them, and another 4. So some of them have to do with the production of farmed fish. Prep bread has to do with a medicine to protect people from HIV transmission and how that could be made into food. Others have to do with the production of wine, and here's mine, which is called Ghost Tortilla, which has to do with delivery platforms and how technology and software is embedded into these production chains as well. You can see more. For example, the last one here is very interesting. It's based on trash and the production of food starting from rubbish or trash. And all of these are documented in a book that was exhibited in the Pavilion, and a series of documents and all of this photographs. So we had a photographer that was sent all over Europe and Spain to all of these sites to photograph our research sites and projects from all of the participants. He did a great job. His name is Pedro Pejenaute. And having that collection of photographs, I think, is quite extraordinary, quite an incredible document about all of those landscapes that are very often invisible. Ghost Tortilla, which is my contribution or recipe, is a recipe of tortilla. So tortilla is this Spanish food. It's a very traditional Spanish dish. It's different. The tortilla, meaning of the word tortilla, is different in peninsular Spanish than in Mexican Spanish. So in Spain, it is an omelet made of potatoes and onions and eggs. And it takes a while to cook. It takes like an hour or two. So it's something that feels very homey to many people. And with the word ghost, I wanted to bring it into its meaning how ghost kitchens or dark kitchens are involved in the production of traditional foods today and their consumption. The recipe starts with this text, which talks about the reverse journey of this food, starting from when it enters your mouth and how in reverse it goes out onto the plate. And then we do the entire journey from the time when all of its ingredients were produced, but also all of the agents that are involved in its production. And this is inspired by a recipe written by Bucky Fuller, where he was trying to demonstrate the idea that even the most banal acts have planetary links and ties to landscapes and architectures that sometimes or very often span continents, even when it's the simplest gesture, like eating just a potato and egg dish. In this case, there is involvement from software development, from data centers, from writers, people's labor, and not just the material production, but also the intellectual production of what goes into ordering and delivering this omelet. In the material production of that omelet, there is an involvement of actual chickens and eggs. And we also visited the farms that produce those chickens and eggs. And I liked to put these two images together of a data farm and a chicken farm, which are actually laid out in the same way. So the same architectural principle governs the spatial distribution of actual data and chickens. And both are involved in the making of this omelet. I also found a parallel between the data cables, the submarine data cables that transport data across the United States, from the United States into Europe, and vice versa. You can see on the left a map of the submarine cables that transport internet data between two continents. The section of said cables in the center, those cables are really big. They're like 1 meter tall, and they have that structure inside. And the structure of this omelet, which represents an ideal omelet made by an AI that has learned from millions of images of these omelets on the internet. So it's not a concrete omelet, but rather a kind of platonic representation of it. Of course, very circular. I was also interested in these two cavernous spaces. On the left, you can see the path of the riders as they go pick up this omelet, this tortilla, from a dark kitchen in Madrid. So this is the path that they take and where they have to go in order to pick it up from the dark kitchen inside of a building. And on the right, you can see the inside of the backpack where the tortilla is delivered, so the rider's backpack. I was also interested in showing how software is produced. So here you can see how a layout for an app or something like Uber Eats or another delivery platform, there is a layout and then there is the content. And these two things are separate. The images, the restaurants, all these things are considered content and are separate in their production and in their conception from the layout of the app. So there is this very clear distinction in software between the supporting structure, the supporting layout of the software, and the content that gets fed into it, which is another type of data. And the recipe explores the similarities and the diversity between these elements. And it does so through a very concrete research into 3 dark kitchens in Madrid. The first one is situated in a place called Mercado de Barceló, which is in the center of Madrid. And this market is a produce market. So there are people there selling fruit, vegetables, fish. And during the pandemic, or even before, that kind of market, I think in Spain, but in many other European countries, has just become less and less attractive to people. And so there are usually many vacancies in the spaces inside these markets. And some of them have become dark kitchens. So delivery kitchens restaurants where they only serve a delivery platform. And in the case of omelets, one thing that is interesting is that if you Google the dish that you want to eat, for example, omelet, like tortilla, you're going to find all of these restaurants. So these are not dishes, these are restaurants, where each restaurant has the name of the dish. And that is because the search, when you perform a search, people are looking for the dish that they want to eat and not so much the name of the restaurant that they want to eat it from. Therefore, when one has a dark kitchen, it is more profitable to have a restaurant that specializes in one type of food because it's going to be more findable on this surface. Therefore, the design of this software informs the types of restaurants and kitchens that exist in very real places like the Mercado de Barceló. And this design actually comes from a design like this that seems to be agnostic to that concept. But in those layers of this design that may not be apparent, there is that information embedded that eventually changes something very real, like this market. Inside of this market, you can see what the inside looks like. So there you can see some produce and some fish. Those are in the center. And then the kitchens are laid out around. So where you see 1, 2, 3, 4, those are dark kitchens. One of them specializing only in these omelets. And this is the path that the riders take from the entrance that you've seen in the corner, up the escalators, and then into the kitchens, and they go past the people who are buying fish and produce. And I found that to be very opportunistic, like the kind of thing that has happened over the centuries in every city where nooks are found by people who are looking for the opportunity, and then architecture enables that and changes our own understanding of the city. The second example is Las Margaritas. So Las Margaritas is a restaurant that's very traditional. It has existed for a long time, and many people go there. It's a very established restaurant. And they wanted to be more modern and also serve delivery. And so I interviewed the owner, and he gave me this very interesting tour where he had discovered that the riders who were coming to pick up the food were crowding the space that he wanted to be very polished for the customers that come to the restaurant. So he decided that he was going to build a separation between the delivery riders and the customers, by creating an underground tunnel underneath his building that connects the kitchen directly with the exterior on the backside of the building. And so in the same kitchen, he's cooking restaurant food for his Las Margaritas brand restaurant for the normal customers, and also for another several brands that he operates, pretending to serve specific foods. So he has one he may have one for tortillas and another one for fish and another one for hamburgers, and they all come from the same kitchen, but then the ones that are for delivery are delivered through this tunnel that we're going to go through in a moment. So now we're starting to go through the tunnel. So whenever food needs to be delivered, it's produced in the kitchen, and then it goes through this tunnel. And he explained to me that as the delivery platforms matured, in the beginning there was an excess of riders. There were many riders, but then there were some changes and some laws that came into effect that made it more difficult for riders to be hired, to be fired. They gave them more rights, and they became more scarce. And suddenly his bottleneck was that there were fewer riders, and the riders would only come to his restaurant if it was convenient for them. So he thought that he needed to give something to these riders. So he decided to make a waiting room, and he had plans to make his waiting room better and better. So now he has the kitchen and he has a tunnel underneath, and then that is connected with an exterior space where he offers water and snacks to the riders in order to attract them. And I find this is the space that he's trying to make attractive for the riders. As you can see, it's not a very attractive space, but it is still competitive with the other spaces that the riders are going to. And I find that to be very interesting because you can see the direct effect of software and legislation about software into architectural form. This is a restaurant that is evolving specifically to respond to the needs imposed by software design. And this is the result of the space that ensues from those design decisions. So that's what a modern restaurant looks like. And a third evolution of delivery platforms is the creation of kitchens that are clustered and built on purpose to serve as dark kitchens only. So in the first example, we've seen the opportunistic dark kitchen. Then in the second example, we've seen the dark kitchen evolving out of a traditional restaurant. And in this example, we're going to explore a brand in Spain that just operates in Spain, but there are some international brands like Cloud Kitchens specifically is the name of the biggest one, that build warehouse-style buildings full of kitchens inside, very small kitchens. So here you can see a typical floor plan of these kitchens, and each of the units is a kitchen for rent. So it may serve one brand or many brands, one restaurant or many restaurants, one type of food or many. So there is no correlation between the restaurant name, the type of the food, and the space where it is produced anymore. Those three things are completely decoupled in this new model. Here you can see a zoom of how that works. So some spaces are shared, like the cooler and the freezer, the ice room, or the trash, but then everything else is this small catering kitchens. And Cloud Kitchen sells them or rents them like this, with this basic furnishing. And then the people who rent them for their restaurant are supposed to furnish them further and enable their production of their food. There are also famous restaurants that exist in a physical location, and then they also hire dark kitchens in order to do delivery instead of having that being done in their actual restaurant space. That's a typical kitchen example in that typology. And here you can see one of those kitchens live in Madrid. where the screens take a prominent role. And then this is above, where all of the kitchens are laid out. The ventilation systems are taking all the fumes out. Of course, the opportunity has also been found by other companies to try and insert that typology in vacant spaces, or supposedly vacant spaces in the city, such as in between buildings. So here you can see an ambitious project in Madrid that made many people enraged and eventually was demolished after many protests, where what you see is a warehouse where lots of kitchens are being built, and then there's this gigantic ventilation shaft and tower on the side. And the people around this, of course, were very upset that they would have all of this fumes and smells and things being around them. And so as these protests make legislation advance and make the rules around these kitchens and their insertion into the city change, I think it's interesting to look at this as an opportunity. Is the city able to be resilient enough to bring this industrial type of production back into the city? You know that in the 20th century, things like cattle were expelled from urban cities and urban centers throughout Europe. And now we're bringing this, now there's this need to bring something that is seen as industrial and polluting back into cities. And the resistance that emerges from that, I think, is also an interesting tension between urban design and the demands of people. How invisible do we want to make this? How far away do we want to take it from the city? And how engaged do we want to be with the lives of the people that enable food delivery? Do we just want to hide it? Is that the perfect solution? Or do we want to make cities that can house those needs? Or are those needs just to be eliminated? Are they just simply moral? So I think those are some of the questions that architects could ask themselves about dark kitchens in particular. But more broadly, there's a reflection here on how software changes the world in a way that should not only be addressed with legislation or with reactionary movements towards the problems that it creates, but also from the beginning. How do we design that software so that the cities and the spaces that it creates are the cities and the spaces that we want to live in? And that's the end. Thank you very much. What questions do you have?
We'll have the room for any questions that
Well, I have a question. I think this is a very interesting lecture, and there's a lot of things that I think I never really thought about in terms of like delivery and in terms of the greater systems that are behind how we get the food that we eat. And I think embedded in a lot of what you're talking about, what I see is like a question of temporality. And I think, I guess, not even just in food delivery, but also in all of society, things are getting faster and faster. And like, for example, when you click a blind product delivery app, immediately a timer starts, and that timer is the ultimate governor of everything. Right? You have to get food ready, you have to get the driver in transit, you have to make sure that everything is, like according to that schedule, and the customer is at the very top of that spectrum, I guess. And we also see like examples of, for example, food needing to be fresh, and it needs to be from a source in the morning, and it needs to be prepared in the middle of the day, and then needs to be eaten later. So there's a lot of, I guess, systems that are tied to this idea of time. And I think, or I guess, how would you see this, like as we progress into the future, and as like things like delivery apps compress things that normally would take a long time to a much smaller period of time? When or how does architecture and how do cities, for example, respond to that? Like how do we structure cities so that these things happen in a more efficient or better way in your view?
I think that it's a fascinating question. Thank you for that question. So the reason why dark kitchens appear in the middle of cities is not because those spaces are cheap. Quite the opposite. They are very expensive. It is a vector of time. So those kitchens want to be there and need to be there because they are governed by a time algorithm. And if the kitchen is far away from the city, then it's not going to be able to serve in a certain amount of time. And that calculation of time is based on the current conditions of the infrastructure of the city. So it's based on the idea that some person could ride on a bike and go from point A to point B organically in a certain amount of time. The city was not actually designed for that. It was not designed to have kitchens and then have people delivering things all around it. But in the design and production of that software, there is the assumption that the city is a stable thing, that is that the conditions under which it exists and has been designed will just stay there no matter what we do on top of it. And so that even if we insert these riders, their number is kind of never going to be enough that it's going to change the conditions of the city. But the truth is that it does. And we've seen that it does. So food delivery doesn't mean that restaurants that previously existed now have more opportunities to serve food. Rather, it becomes a new kind of business, a new kind of doing food and consuming food. And I think the vector of time is very critical in this respect because time in software is abstract, whereas time in the city is spatial. It is marked by distance between point A and point B. And so because software doesn't have to take that into account, the city is then the organism that absorbs that stress, that problem. And that is where these problems ensue. I think that sometimes I've seen responses to this as, well, let's make it more efficient. Let's make underground tunnels where food can be moved and Amazon packages can move at high speeds under the ground and can be delivered immediately so that the warehouses and the centers, the sorting centers and the kitchen can still be outside of the city, but then can inject these things into the city very quickly. And I think that again assumes that the city is a monolith, that it is something that even if you tunnel it underground with high-speed package delivery, it wouldn't change. Like the surface conditions would not change, when indeed they would. So I think that time in software being abstract and time in architecture not being abstract, being related to space, makes this problem very unique. And I think that architects just have an answer to that, have an intuition for that, that doesn't exist from the side of business sometimes or from the side of software. Yes?
Thanks for your lecture.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, how did so you work through different mediums, right? You work through, I guess, photogrammetry, software design, all these kind of softwares. I was wondering how these modes of representations are helping you to suggest something to the question you asked in the end, which is, what is the role of the architect in this? Since you're using architectural modes of representation, how do they help you suggest possible solutions, possible iterations for the futures?
I was interested in using a variety of media to describe this research because I wanted to describe, because I was discovering different things. So the handheld phone video that I showed that was actually taken by the owner of the restaurant, that is also a form of architectural representation. It's not just plans or sections. We also represent architecture by just moving through it. I also use the photogrammetry to represent that Mercado de Barceló building. That building is actually very beautiful on the outside. It's a famous building in Madrid. It's white on the exterior. It's very abstract. It was developed by a famous architecture studio, won many awards. If you see it in person, it doesn't have that darkness and that cavernous gut-like, bowel-like feeling that I was trying to convey with the photogrammetry. The photogrammetry was interesting for me for that representation because it has a reach. So when you're doing photogrammetry with a phone, you have a reach of about 3 meters or 6 feet above the ground from the LiDAR scanner, and above that, the phone doesn't proceed, doesn't go on. So you end up with this tunnel-like spaces or 3D models that represent a kind of cocoon that moves with the person that is moving across space. It's very much like the movement inside of a bowel, where it's just this sphere around the person and the sphere of movement and how it intersects with the actual architecture. And so I find that is a somewhat fascinating way of representing architecture. What is that intersection of my sphere, my LiDAR sphere of perception with the actual built surfaces of this building? And then what is the texture and the quality of those surfaces? In the case of this building, all of the white, beautiful, glowing, bright surfaces are away from that bubble. They are above, they are on the facade, and they are never experienced in this skin contact almost type of space. And it was interesting for me to try and use that to represent the experience of the writer, to represent how it moves. In the case of the kitchens that are where I was showing a plan and I drew a plan of the kitchens themselves, I was interested in the business model, in the typology, the creation of a typology, and how this repetition of a cell becomes a typology for a building that then gets repeated in the city, and that is a business model. That is a unit, and that unit then can be copy-pasted everywhere. And so I think that the plan, the floor plan, is an adequate medium to represent that copy-pastedness of these kitchens everywhere. I think that the photography project that was part of the commission from the Biennale, sending this photographer to all of these sites, also gave a quality to the project that I found very interesting. I like this image a lot because in the beginning I was telling the photographer, well, I want to photograph the writers. The writers are part of my story. Can you go to these places where there are writers waiting and photograph how they wait? And those are images that I've seen in newspapers very often, where you see writers, you see the neighbors being angry, and there is this clash, and the writers are on their bike. And he went there and tried. And he came back telling me they didn't want to be photographed. They were getting angry at me. They're not proud of doing this work. They know that the neighbors hate them. They don't want to appear on the newspaper with their face attached to this bad press. This is not a honorable portrait that they wanted me to take to be published. And the only photograph he could take was of the interior of the backpack, which I find looks like a space in itself. And so that's also part of the architectural representation of stories, that sometimes we have images in our head that come from the press or that come from our imagination. And when you confront the reality in doing a research work, sometimes those images have to change. Reality doesn't want those images to be taken. And I think that putting that as part of your journey as a researcher was also interesting for me in this project.
Yeah, there is something really interesting in what you're saying now, where we kind of find this tension again between representation and the human that's being documented. And I think with the use of photogrammetry, that allows you to also locate certain gaps by representing, you capture stuff, you don't capture everything. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if also you could use these gaps in your favor as continue documenting this issue, which I think could benefit from these stories that tell about tension between human representation, class struggle, money issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that photogrammetry is an extremely interesting tool.
Yeah,
I think that many uses that I've seen, because it's so new, people use it in very straightforward manners, right? Very as a tool that simplifies other ways of working. But I think it is a medium in itself. Like all the glitches that it produces, all the gaps that it produces, as you're saying, have a meaning, and you can use them to your advantage to represent whatever you want. It's also one thing that's also very interesting about photogrammetry is that it only captures surfaces. It has no understanding of what is underneath something else or on the other side of something else. It understands reality as this continuous surface, like continuous, just this infinitely folded surface. And I think that's also philosophically very interesting if that's how you want to represent space.
Like Michael Young, he's actually teaching a master's class where they're focusing on photogrammetry. So like a lot of this, yeah. I know you're in it. So like,
yeah, we did it. That's why I'm
nice.
We're actually constantly looking for ways to really anchor the medium. It's actually a perfect representation. Can talk about it. But not yet.
Yes. Yes.
It's my second time watching it. I have a question about you were talking about reality, and your work previously was AI, and it's the same. Like, I want to ask what your sort of conception of realness is, like what counts as real, because in your AR projects, in the one with the living space, the digital living space, it's expressed as just points on the screen space. And then the ghost tortilla is the platonic image of a tortilla. And then all those kitchens, although there are real spaces, they actually exist in the digital world more than they do in the physical one.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask, like, can you really draw a line there?
I'm really scared of your question because I feel like you understand me better than myself. I understand myself. You were just able to draw a line between everything I've ever done so elegantly. I mean, that's the fascination, I think. When I was talking about this model that I made that looked like it could not stand, but it somehow stood there, and it was like difficult to understand if it was standing or hanging or, if it existed or not. That's kind of what fascinates me, like the ambivalence. And when you see when you talk about what's real and what's not, so the difference is what is physical and what is digital, right? Part of this project is about actually articulating that part of what we perceive as digital is also physical. So there isn't that much of a clear cut between the two. And I think that playing with this is so hard for me to express because I don't have an answer. Like, this is what I'm actually into. So you see, augmented reality, it takes physical reality for granted and then tries to overlay a digital layer on it. So it's a platform between the physical world and what we perceive the physical world to be. And existing in that margin is where AR inserts itself and changes our perception of what is physical, thereby changing probably in the future what actually gets built as physical, what is perceived as real or not real. The truth is that obviously both what is digital and is physical are both real things. But then you also run into the problem of what happens when different people see different things because their perception is mediated by AR or by the internet or by another type of media. And they believe that what is physical is different from one another. In that case, it's like the description of a completely psychotic society, right? Where everybody has a different perception and there's no common ground for what is real or what is not. And I think that physical grounding is becoming ever more elusive, but I think that there's a real risk in taking it for granted. When I was trying to explain that this difference between space and time, how time is understood by software very well and quantified, but space is not taken into account, it's just quantified as time, right? Distance is just quantified as time. When we abstract what is physical, like space, because we take it for granted, we believe that it's just going to continue to exist the way it does, we eventually change it. And I think that is a very architectural project in itself, the manipulation and the control of the physical reality. Not of all reality, just physical reality, even just focusing ourselves on that. There's nobody else paying attention to it really in the world. Many other agents in society pay attention to other manifestations that arise from physical conditions, but rarely to their physical configuration and their spatial configuration. And because that is a uniquely architectural project, I think that there is a real importance of the architectural discipline being embedded in the production of software, in the production of those other layers that mediate between the physical space and what people are increasingly perceiving. When people are shopping for tortilla and they look up tortilla, those are restaurants. We still call those restaurants, right? And they're not restaurants anymore. They are this other thing that we don't even know on a daily basis what it is. It's a dark kitchen. It's a small nook in a market, or it's in a warehouse, but we still call it restaurant, and we imagine it's a real restaurant. And so that decoupling of the physical reality from the perceived reality as represented on the internet or in virtual media, I think that's what makes this project an architecture project. Which may not be immediately obvious why it's an architecture project, but that is the reason why. That was a very complicated answer. Yeah.
There's a tiny confusion, I'm not sure if you can tell me this. There's tiny confusion between what is used as architecture media and what is used as architecture media to depict, what is used as architecture media as the restriction that you have based on that person who's using the space. I don't know if it's okay, but this picture, you got it by a restriction that you had in reality, right?
Yes.
By inquiring a certain person, but I feel like other mediums or other representations that you use actually lack this embodiment. Do you agree with me or not?
If other representations lack the embodiment of what? Research.
Those characters, for example, refusing to show their faces or show this, that, sometimes the choice of representation is very intentional.
Yes.
And sometimes
not. Yes, for example, in the picture of the chickens, the chickens laid out in rows and the data center. So that was a very, very deliberate comparison of two images. We knew that we could obtain both of those images, and I deliberately wanted to put them side by side in the exhibition to make a statement. So in that case, the image is very much a narrative manipulation, whereas this is more of a thing I learned. Discovery.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is really refreshing. Like I feel like in your presentation, these are the moments where that we can connect. That can personally really touched me when you overlaid this narrative with this image. Because it has something very behind it, rather than the complete absence of human presence that is used just as a narrative image. Makes sense.
Yeah, there's a difference between a design project and a research project. I think in a design project, like in a research project, you need to be open to surprise.
Yep.
You need to be open to reality contradicting what you thought you were going to discover. And you need to be honest about that.
Yeah.
But you also need to have some level of deliberateness about what you're trying to research. Because it's not just a journal of things you encountered on your way. It's also something that you want to prove or something that you want to demonstrate, a story you want to tell. I mean, I think that also a design journey or designing something or an artistic practice is about finding that balance between the moments when you're in control and the moments when you let the process surprise you, right? And you can't just go all the way in one or the other direction, because if you're in control all the time, you're not going to discover anything. Why did you even make the effort? Like, the idea was already there, so why? And if you let reality just take you through any rabbit hole, then that's also not design, right? That's just our experience as humans through the world, and that's less of a story and less of a design. It's more of what happened, phenomenology or something like that.
Well, I kind of had a question, but
yes.
The theme for the lecture series this year, I don't know if like many people have read the posters. It's called Making Sense, and we're trying to highlight architects that work with architecture that directly, I guess, stimulates human senses, and we were initially looking for lectures that could speak on like specific, like either taste, smell, sight, and I guess when that was at least my intention, I now realizing like how maybe shallow that was, because from watching your lecture, it's like more than just how a space affects like one specific sense, but how like more than just space is affecting how we experience architecture, like how the digital realm is alternating how we perceive things and also how the architecture is built. So I guess my question is like how do you perceive how like human to human interaction is like affected by both the digital realm and also the architecture affected by that? Like, I know you did touch on that through like the delivery drivers and the neighbors, but I'm more so interested in that, in what you talked about in the beginning of your presentation with your more like personal work.
I think that's such a huge question, because the way you ask it is like, well, it is everything. Like, it's a description of everything. Like, how does the physical world and virtual things mediate in relationships between humans to human relationships and human to space relationships? Man, I think that it's interesting that you started your question from the idea of the senses, like that you wanted to do this lecture series about how architecture was affecting the senses, right? And spaces built specifically to affect senses, and not just vision, I imagine, because usually that is taken for granted in architecture, that everybody who enters the space is going to see it, even though there are many architectures that are very interesting to that are made not to be seen, but rather to be perceived in different ways, to be cold, to be hot, to for people to get lost in them, to hide things, right? Not everything is made to be seen, but it's kind of the pervasive sense. I think there is this very trite sentence of how technology stops being a tool and becomes an extension of ourselves, right? And natural humans are supposed to have five senses. Some people argue we have more or less, and some people less. And in my opinion, tools like the internet or AR augment our senses. They give us more senses, more ways of perceiving reality, more ways of interpreting it, more ways of communicating with it, or communicating person to person, so that without the internet, you and I can only talk in person, but with the internet, we can send a signal or send an emoji, and we understand each other. And so we use vision to understand each other through this augmentation that is enabled by technology. And we don't give names to those senses as senses, but they are ways in which our perception gets expanded and expanded. And I think that as architectural spaces tailor themselves to be perceived by these expanded senses, that's when we could say that the virtual is affecting the physical. So, for example, in augmented reality, I recently published an article in which I tried to argue that homes will become an infinite screen. That the purpose of home in the future could be to just be an infinite screen, a screen all around you. And the reason why that would be made possible is because you have this extension of your sense of vision that may be over your eyes, let's say in the form of AR, that enables you to perceive your space as a multiplicity of spaces. Therefore, the space itself must respond to that new sense that you have and accommodate it, make it possible, become a platform for that, for you to perceive it through your extended senses. I think that the essence of technology, not just technology in the sense of the internet, today's technology, but all throughout the history of humankind, is that extension of our senses. And that architecture has, even just the evolution of a city, has just responded to that continuous extension and expansion of our capabilities as humans with technology. It was a very difficult question.
So I can just have a question. So
Thank you.
Thank you.